Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is 4 o'clock Eastern time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you all to the Dibble Institute's second Wednesday webinar titled Tips for Teaching Relationship Education in High Schools, Lessons from the Field. And it's going to be by Ms. Flip-Fost and Dr. Brian Gessling. So my name is Rachel here with the Dibble Institute, and behind the scenes is the wonderful Kathy, who keeps everything kind of running for us and managing all the tech stuff. So thank you to her. And next slide, please. So before we get into the webinar, I just want to go over some housekeeping items with everyone, including the phone number and access code to use. If you're unable or don't prefer to access the audio for the webinar through your phone, you can access it through that link and this other information on the slide. Also, throughout the webinar, there are several ways to participate. So we'll have some poll questions during the presentation. They'll show up on your screen, and you'll just select your response using your mouse and clicking whichever item you are choosing to respond with. And at the end of the webinar, there will be some time for Q&A with the presenters. So we do ask that you write down and save any content-related questions until closer to the end of the presentation so they don't get mixed up with anyone who may be writing in with access-related issues or anything else. And lastly, a few days from now, you will be able to access the recording of this webinar at our website at the link included there at the very bottom. And I'll be handing this over in just a moment to our presenters, but before I do, I'd like to present some background information on the Dibble Institute for those of you who may be listening for the first time. So this is our founder, Charlie Dibble, and his wife, Helen. Charlie was an engineer by trade, and as such, he sought solutions to issues. And about 30 years ago, he saw how young people's relationships and those of their parents were affecting the outcomes of young people, and not always in a positive way. So he began asking lead experts in the field of education what was being done to help young people develop skills to create stable families. And the Dibble Institute continues his work by advocating for the effectiveness of relationship skill programming for youth and young adults, and publishes research and evidence-based relationship education materials. And now Dibble is a national nonprofit mission-driven organization. So we're able to reach many young people thanks to the efforts of you and many others that are partnering with us. And we couldn't have reached the 1.5 million young people that we have in the last 15 years without caring people like each of you who are here on this webinar and our wonderful presenters. So a big thanks to all of you. And next, I'd just like to briefly highlight our core values. So first, we believe in research. So that means we are relying on current research to keep our materials up to date and relevant to the people that we're serving. And next. We also believe in stable, healthy families of all different types. So research continues to show that children do best when raised with the healthy involvement of two parents, and that their relationship matters whether these parents are together or apart. So I'd like to point out that this doesn't mean that we are anti-divorce. We understand that not all families have two parents in the household, and research supports that complex, high conflict, and abusive situations are not good for children. So we support, again, stable and healthy families. That's our mission. And that includes single parents, grandparents, step-parents, and extended family who do great jobs and have great outcomes. And we also believe that all people deserve respect and that all relationships can be improved with relationship skills. Now for the real reason that you all are here, if we can go to the next slide, I'd like to offer a brief introduction to our presenters before handing it over to them. So Flip-Fost serves as the Director of Programs for More Than Conquerors, Inc., or MTCI, in Conyers, Georgia. And she's responsible for the overall administration of youth development services. And she's been the principal investigator in obtaining local, state, and federal funding for the organization since 1999. And under her direction, More Than Conquerors has served more than 30,000 students. And then Brian Gessling is a senior researcher at Mathematica Policy Research and has expertise in social programs and trends affecting families and youth. He holds a PhD in sociology from the Pennsylvania State University, and among his many responsibilities with Mathematica, Brian serves as the principal investigator for a large multi-site random assignment evaluation of healthy relationship programs for youth. So thank you both so much for being here today, and with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Brian first.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone for attending. I have listened to some of these webinars in the past and have always found them very useful. So I admit I was both excited but also a little nervous when we received the invitation to present. So I hope we can live up to the high standard and provide some useful information for everyone today. So for today's presentation, Ms. Flip and I are going to pass things back and forth a little bit. So I'm going to start by giving you some background information and context. As I'll explain, this work is part of a broader project called the Streams Evaluation that started about 4 years ago. So I'll start by just giving a little background on streams. Then I will turn things over to Ms. Flip to explain more about her organization, MTCI, and provide some tips on the process they use for facilitator hiring, training, and support. She'll spend about 10 minutes or so on that. Then she'll pass it back to me to talk a little bit about curriculum selection and delivery based on some of the data we've been collecting for evaluation. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So before I dive into it, I think Kathy is going to display our first poll question to see how many of you are familiar with the Streams evaluation. And as Rachel mentioned, I think you should be able to sort of hover over with your mouse, select either yes or no for the question whether you're familiar with the Streams evaluation. And that will help give us some sense for the level of detail to provide as we're going forward. So maybe we'll give it a couple minutes here. Okay, so it looks like a little bit of mix. Some folks familiar, 80% no. So for those of you who are new to Streams, let me start by giving you a quick summary. So yeah, Kathy, go on to the next slide. So Streams, this is the Strengthening Relationship Education and Marriage and Services Evaluation. So this is a large-scale multi-site evaluation being conducted by Mathematica and Public Strategies for the Department of Health and Human Services. So we have 5 separate random assignment evaluations of healthy marriage and relationship education programs that are all funded by the Office of Family Assistance in the Administration for Children and Families. So these 5 programs, which you can sort of see here on the map, were selected from a larger pool of federal grantees that had received funding from OFA to deliver healthy marriage relationship education programming starting back in fall of 2015. So in selecting these 5 programs from the larger pool, OFA was particularly interested in looking at understudied populations that had not been included in prior federal evaluations. So most of the prior federal evaluations had focused mostly on programming for adult couples. So one point of emphasis for Streams, there was a particular interest in looking at programming for youth, which is the focus of our presentation today. So we're going to be talking specifically about one of the sites in the evaluation. This is the More Than Conquerors site based in the Atlanta area. Next slide, please. So in this one site, we are working with Flip's organization, More Than Conquerors, to conduct an evaluation of the Relationship Smarts Plus curriculum among 9th grade students in 2 high schools in Georgia. The program was implemented in a required health class for primarily 9th grade students. So the evaluation started back in fall of 2016, and at that time, the current version of the curriculum was Relationship Smarts Plus version 3.0. So that's the version we're using. Since that time, I know there is now a newer 4.0 version of the curriculum available. We're using the older version here because of when the evaluation started. One of the unique parts of the study is that we're actually comparing 2 different versions of the curriculum. I'll explain a little more about this as I go along. And we're comparing both versions of the curriculum to a comparison group of classrooms that did not receive Relationship Smarts Plus. So as many of you likely know, Relationship Smarts Plus is a widely implemented curriculum that was developed by Marlene Pearson and is distributed by the Dibble Institute. The curriculum includes a mix of facilitator-led discussion, interactive activities, and some homework and parent-teen connection activities. So in Georgia, the way this is working is trained facilitators from Flip's organization, MTCI. We're going into the schools once or twice per week to deliver the curriculum as part of a required health class. So I think a fairly typical implementation in high schools. And so it's our experience on this evaluation that we're going to talk about today and is the basis for the tips we plan to share. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, as part of the evaluation, we're testing 2 different versions of the curriculum. One is the full 12-lesson curriculum for version 3.0 of Relationship Smarts Plus, but then we also have a shortened 8-lesson version that was developed specifically for this evaluation. So as many of you likely know, one of the challenges of working in schools is securing enough class time to deliver the full curriculum. So you might have some schools that are interested in doing something on relationship education, but they can't spare enough class time to deliver the full curriculum. So for this evaluation, we had a unique chance to put our heads together with Flip and her team, as well as the curriculum author and several staff from Dibble, to develop this, it's sort of a special shortened version of the curriculum to use for this evaluation. And so this shortened version, this is unique to the evaluation. It's not currently something available for purchase more broadly, but we are studying it as part of the evaluation in order to see what type of difference it made for these students. And hopefully the results of the evaluation will help inform future versions of the curriculum or the implementation guidance that you can provide to schools about how to implement the curriculum. So Kathy, you can change the slide, and now I'm going to pass things over to Ms. Flip to tell you a little more about her organization and the process they use for facilitator hiring, training, and support. So Flip, you want to take it from here?
I will. Thank you, Brian, and thanks everybody for being on the call. We appreciate the opportunity. More Than Conquerors, Inc. has been meeting the needs of students across Metro Atlanta area since 1999. In fact, last month on March 23rd, we celebrated our 20th anniversary, and we celebrated it with having our 20th annual mock wedding, and it was a glorious occasion for the community and for our students. We have administered 3 local, 9 state, and 8 federal awards, and we are the 3rd generational MTCI grantees, and so we have appreciated the opportunity of having been involved in all of this work up to this point. Around 2005-2006, we realized that we needed a different hiring and training process in order to attract and maintain dedicated people. So I know those of you who kind of also sit in the same position as I in terms of bringing on people and wanting to see the very best happen within your organization in order to reach young people and see differences made in their lives. You know what the high cost of training is when you invest a lot in people and then they don't remain. And so we looked at what we were doing, that we needed to do something a little differently. Prior to that time, we primarily considered the educational background and experience in terms of education of potential hirees. But we soon realized that that in itself was not the answer. So we sat and began to brainstorm as to how and what we should do in terms of adopting and interview and hiring methods. And that has continued to change and blossom to what we have in place today. So in about 2006, we began the process of a one-on-one interview with each manager, after which that manager would vote on the persons of their choice, and the person with the highest votes were hired. That kind of helped us a little bit, but that still wasn't the answer. In 2010, we kind of changed that style so that we would have a managerial panel to interview each person coming through the door. Over time, we learned not to rush that process, to be comfortable with our differences as we kind of weighed out what we were looking for in people, and not to hire based on our immediate needs only, but for the long term, as much as we could. Even if that meant going through the search, the interview process, not choosing anyone, and then starting that process all over the new potentials. That takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of patience to trust the process that we're going to come up with the right people. We decided that each one of us should be in 100% agreement before extending an employment opportunity. What we learned is that where one or the other might have been uncomfortable, that will be the very place of trouble in the future, no matter how insignificant that it appeared to be. So we just kind of trusted one another, and when we could say, yes, that person then we all felt good in bringing on that person for an opportunity. Also during that year in 2010, we also, by including 4 additional steps, we provisionally hired double the number of people that we actually needed. And we figured out a process of orientation and training that would take us step by step to hiring permanent people. Secondly, we sought only people who had the heart for the mission and that they would understand that this is beyond a job. This also meant considering people who would commit to beyond an 8-hour day as needed in order to care for our students and for our families. Thirdly, we used those with previous youth development experience and those who knew how to connect, had the connectedness ability as a primary focus for hiring. That could have been in church youth groups, out of a Boys and Girls Club, in Scouts, in education, in other community youth serving organizations, any of those areas where they had had some previous experience in connecting with students. Those who would agree to provisional employment, once selected, then they would begin our orientation and our multi-level training system. So in 2015, we put all of that together, and we've continued to improve on that up to this day. So when we kind of look at our staff now, we have about 21 people on staff. Of that 21, 4 has been employed by More Than Conquerors Inc. greater than 10 years, 9 has been employed for 9 years, 5 for 8 years, and we have 3 newcomers that's been employed from 1 to 3 years. And so we are just like jumping up and down because we are really a connected family as we've come to really know one another at work and beyond. Even when we start looking at our consultants, so we have 6 consultants, and 4 of them have been with us for greater than 9 years, and 2 have been with us for greater than 6 years. So we're kind of looking at the place that we are as a good place. Can we go to the next slide, please?
I think we've got a poll question here first, Ms. Phillip.
We do indeed.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and ask this poll question really quickly. So which, if any, of the following training methods does your organization use? So you can select multiple ones if you use multiple, or E for none of them. Or I guess, sorry, a combination for D. All right, Flip. So there's kind of the breakdown of what people are using.
Okay, and that's really very interesting because like the people who chose D, a combination of these, with More Than Conquerors Inc., yes, we use all of those. And as we start talking about our training, and this is not what we had planned to do, but even in talking about it with our staff and preparing for this webinar, I wanted to pull in our corporate trainer, who is Greg Johnson. And although we've sat together as a team to kind of put the hierarchy of training together, he is the lead person in that. And I'm going to ask Greg, are you on, that you can talk about our pre-service training and piloting?
Okay, thanks, Flip. Well, our training process, as Flip mentioned earlier, is a multi-level approach. And we started this in 2015 in a formal way. And so what happens is the training process for all the provisional hires would be, or the orientation and the training would go in this manner, about 10 hours of organizational orientation. And that was very important for us because we found over the years that if a person didn't connect or find some level of identification with our organizational core values, it was very hard for them to be an effective team member, regardless of what curriculum we're teaching. And then that would be followed by 16 hours of the initial curriculum training per the developers. And then 8 hours initial teach back with feedback, primarily from myself and the director and our program coordinator. And each person would do those teach backs, participate. And then after that, the first selection of those who will move forward. And so we pared down that provisional group to a smaller, more stealth group. Then we're moving to the next level, which included about 8 hours of initial facilitation skills training, which would include classroom management, engaging students, how to handle questions from students, being able to redirect them, recognizing just the hierarchy of students in the classroom and who were the influencers. And then we would go through about 20 hours of additional curriculum training where we would drill down deeper into the original training from the developer and deeper into the scope and sequence, into fidelity compliance, and temper that with personal delivery styles. And then an additional 20 hours of teach back following that. And we would go lesson by lesson through the curriculum following up with feedback after each teach back. And then after that 48 hours or so of additional training level 2, then we would select again those that would move forward. And then level 3 of our training would include more peer-to-peer teachbacks with peer feedback. And we found that to be extremely helpful to get feedback from people that maybe the new facilitators didn't really see them as experts, but they valued their contribution. They would undoubtedly pick up on things that perhaps would get overlooked in some other feedback. And then the final selection of those who will move forward would happen. And then level 4 would include some continuous training and practice with myself, giving a lot of personal coaching. And all of that would tie into the annual review with the developer as well. And then we launched our pilot, which we tried to use students who had already gone through the curriculum. That's what we do now. But we definitely want to do it in a school setting or with students, but not one of the identified program schools. And then the next step would be more observation and monitoring. And that would be facilitated through some unannounced classroom visits, observing the facilitator. And that would be done by myself as corporate trainer, our program evaluator, program director, and coordinator. Not at the same time, but spread out different. They would never know who was coming or when. And just to observe based on the rubric with some immediate feedback. And then all of that was supported through additional trainings through our staff meetings. We have annual staff development and then performance evaluations with some very specific feedback on development so that facilitators would know what areas to focus on to just increase their effectiveness. Okay, Flip, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. And so one of the things that we like to also do in terms of expectations for our facilitators is encouraging that level of high performance through incentives on that. And so as we looked at our observation and monitoring technique, we wanted to be able to ensure the fidelity through the use of adherence measures, but also when we start the observation, just as Greg had talked about, through our observation rubric that he in fact formatted, and it's on a 100% scale. And so then the educators know at what point that they need to work on, at least to be up to what would be an average expectation. But now that we have people who've been doing this for a while, what we're seeing is as they've gotten familiar with the curriculum is that we're meeting and exceeding what the expectation would be on that rubric. And when we walk into the classrooms, we like to see everybody in the same place in the curriculum as they go forth using their own personal teaching styles. And so with that, I want to pull it back to Brian as we've shared kind of a general summary of how we do things here at MTCI. Brian is going to take on all the techie stuff. Hit it, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Flip. I'll try to live up to that. And thank you for, I know one thing in working with your organization, I've been very impressed by all the staff we've interacted with and just the commitment to the training and fidelity. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about some tips around curriculum selection and delivery. And I should start by explaining that the tips in this section really come from data we collected from students in participating in the evaluation. So specifically, when students first enrolled in the study, we had them complete a baseline survey that included a series of questions about students' attitudes, their expectations, and their experiences. And then we really spent a lot of time looking through the data to try to draw out some lessons and tips that would inform the evaluation, but also would have some use more generally for the field. And I should say here that it turned out when we talked to Flip and her team about this, it turned out they were already doing a lot of these. So the tips didn't really change necessarily what MTCI was doing or factor into the evaluation in any formal way. But we thought that these tips nevertheless might have some use for the broader field, especially for any of you that might be either new to this type of program or looking for new ideas for your programming, or just looking for additional thoughts on how to offer relationship education in schools. So Kathy, next slide, please. So when we first started looking at our data, the first thing that really stood out is just how few students had exposure to relationship education classes before they reached high school. So among our stream students, only about a quarter of the students said they had attended a class on romantic relationships or dating in the year before they had filled out the survey. A slightly greater percentage of students, about 1 in 3, said they had attended a class on teen pregnancy or STIs, and fewer students said they had attended a class on dating violence or marriage. And I should specify here that students answered these questions at the start of the semester before they had attended any of the classes for streams. So these low percentages are not a reflection of MTCI or anything we did for streams. And I think this is also pretty consistent with national data showing that relatively few students receive formal education before reaching high school on relationships. And so based on these findings, we really took this to mean that when teaching relationship education in schools, it's really important to start with the basics and choose an introductory curriculum that covers the basic relationship education topics. So this includes things like knowing the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, knowing what goes into a successful relationship, and knowing what to look for in a romantic partner. So for any of you educators or facilitators who might be listening to this webinar, and for program directors and school staff, I know you are living this stuff day in and day out, and after a while, the topics almost become second nature. So when we were looking at this data, it just really stood out that from the student's perspective, a lot of this information is going to be very new to them. And so you don't necessarily need to, my apologies, you don't necessarily need to worry that any of the curriculum lessons are too basic for students or that lessons repeat what students have learned in other classes. It's going to be new for them. So the other point that goes along with this is that most students say they really want to learn this information. So if you look at findings from national surveys of young adults, or probably even just from your own experience, you'll find that students say they wish they had received more guidance on romantic relationships in school, and that they value learning things like dealing with the emotional aspects of relationships, how to have a mature relationship, and how to deal with conflict or breakups in relationships. And so you can really expect that students will be engaged in the classes and find the information useful, and again, that it doesn't repeat what they may have learned in other classes. So next slide, please. Okay, the second tip in this area is just to think about how to make it relevant. And what we mean by this is to really help students see how the information in the curriculum is relevant to their lives, not just in the short run, but also in the future. So when we were looking through the data, one thing that stood out to us was that many of the students said they had a hard time seeing themselves in adult relationships. So for example, one question on the survey asked students if they were likely to get married in the future. So for this question, we found that only about half of the students said they were more likely than not to get married. Another question asked about cohabitation, and for this one, only about 1 in 4 students said they were more likely than not to live with a romantic partner before marriage. And we were actually a little surprised at these findings because they are at odds with current rates of marriage and cohabitation in the US, which show that the majority of young adults are likely to both live with an unmarried partner and eventually get married. And in talking to Flip and her staff, it sounds like they had also seen this play out in the classroom as well, that when you're a 9th grader in your high school health class, it might be hard to imagine that you'll be living with a romantic partner or getting married someday. It may just seem fairly abstract. And so for facilitators, I think this means that one of the things you can do to help is to make it more concrete and explain to students that even for students who have a hard time envisioning themselves in adult relationships right now, that it's important to start thinking about it so that they're really prepared when the time comes to start making these decisions. Next slide, please. So now this is one of my personal favorites because one of the things I admire most about good facilitators and teachers is their ability to connect with students from different backgrounds and with different experiences. So as I'm part of the research team, so I'm usually sitting in my office and don't get out into the schools and the classrooms very often, but when I do, one of the things that always strikes me is how much the kids have just happening in their lives and how in some ways the students are very similar, but in other ways the students may be very different. And as a facilitator, the challenge of sort of just getting the class together as a cohesive group, despite their different experiences and backgrounds. And so one example of this is just thinking about the different relationship experiences reflected in a typical class of high school students. So as I mentioned earlier, for this evaluation, the curriculum was offered as part of a required health class for mostly 9th grade students. And so in those classes, what we found was that about 1 in 3 students said they were currently in a dating relationship. And some described that relationship as seriously dating, other students described themselves as casually dating. And then the majority of students, about 69%, described themselves as not currently in a relationship. So if these are your students, the immediate challenge you face going into the classroom is just trying to think, how are you going to offer something for everyone? And one way to do that, I think, is by choosing a curriculum that has a mix of activities and discussion topics. So for example, for students currently in relationships, they might benefit from discussions or classroom activities on how to handle conflict or problems in their relationships. Whereas for students that aren't currently in relationships, they might benefit more from information on what to look for in a romantic partner or how to know when they are ready for a relationship. So the general point being that it's important to have a mix and to have a curriculum that offers a mix that's going to serve all the students. In addition, as I'm sure many of you know, students' relationships, especially at this age, can change very quickly. So even if the information is not relevant immediately, students might be able to use it in the near future as their relationships change. So Kathy, you can change the slide. So the 4th tip we had in this section is to emphasize that good relationships require certain skills. So on our STREAM survey, we asked students a series of questions about whether they felt confident in their ability to have stable long-term relationships. And somewhat to our surprise, most of the students expressed a high level of confidence. They felt that they really had what it takes to have stable long-term relationships. And again, this is before they had even received any of the instruction. They expressed a high level of confidence. And so it was somewhat surprising to us. So we dug into the data a little bit more. And when we looked at another set of questions that asked about specific relationship skills, so for example, we looked at questions about conflict management skills and different types of communication skills. And here it was interesting. What we found was that students were somewhat less confident when we asked about these specific skills. So for example, when asked if they could admit to being wrong during an argument, only about half the students said that they were good at that. Or similarly, just about half the students said they were good at working through problems without arguing. So there was just a bit of a disconnect. On the one hand, students felt that they sort of knew what it takes to have a long-term stable relationship. But then when we asked about sort of the more specific skills, they were a little less sure. And so I think as one of Flip's colleagues put it when we were discussing the data with them, it's sort of sometimes students don't know what they don't know, and maybe that sort of explains the disconnect that we were seeing. So one thing we took from that was just the importance of, when teaching lessons on relationship skills, it's important to motivate the lessons by explaining to students that relationships are not something that people are sort of naturally either good or bad at, that successful relationships require specific skills that people can practice and improve. And it's these specific skills that are the things that go into relationships in the long term. And so you can explain to students that by learning certain skills, such as how to work through problems without arguing and how to admit to being wrong during an argument, that it's really these skills that will make it easier for their relationships to live up to their expectations that they have for them, and their high hopes that they do have the ability to have sort of stable long-term relationships. Kathy, next slide, please. And then the final tip here relates to gender norms. And again, this tip really emerged from the data, where in looking through the data, we noticed that we were finding a lot of differences in how students answered questions about relationship attitudes and expectations between the girls and boys in the classes. So just to give you one example, as I mentioned previously, we had asked the students a series of questions about their expectations for the future. For example, whether they're expected to get married, whether they're expected to have kids, and so on. And for these questions, we were somewhat surprised to find that boys were actually more likely than girls to express expectations for these different outcomes. For example, boys were more likely than girls to say they expected to get married. Boys were also more likely to say they expected to have children in the future. And so this was surprising to us, in part because it's sort of the opposite pattern from what has been true historically. So for example, if you go back and look through national survey data through the years, historically girls have been more likely than boys to say they expect to get married and to have kids. And so when we were looking at the data for these stream students and seeing the opposite pattern, we took that as some evidence of changing gender norms, and seeing how changing gender norms were playing out in the expectations that the girls especially were expressing. And so this is just one example. And I think the broader point that we saw in the data and that we're getting at this tip here is just that when teaching a class on romantic relationships, that you can really expect that gender norms are going to be a recurring theme of the class discussions and your interactions with the students. So in some cases, students might be using gender norms and stereotypes to support their opinions. Other students may be raising points or asking questions that are trying to question prevailing norms and stereotypes. Or other students may feel reluctant to express views that they feel run counter to societal messages about gender. So as educators and facilitators, I think it's important to be ready for these discussions and to be prepared to manage them. So part of that means encouraging a supportive classroom environment in which students really feel comfortable expressing their beliefs and values, but it also means challenging students to think critically about their opinions and being ready to dispel harmful myths or stereotypes that might emerge during the class discussion. And so I know these conversations aren't easy, and unfortunately I don't have any magical advice for exactly how to do it, but I recognize that it's very important work, and I have a lot of respect and admiration for Flip and all of you out there in the field who are doing it on a daily basis in the classroom. So Kathy, you can go on to the next slide. So if you want more information about the evaluation or the tips that we have shared, we have several written reports available. So first, we have a research to practice brief that covers some of the tips on curriculum selection and delivery. And Kathy has attached that to the webinar. So if you look over on your right-hand side of the screen under handouts, there's a PDF file there that's the research to practice brief. I believe they'll also post that with the webinar recording when that goes up. In addition to the research to practice brief, we also have an implementation report that goes into a lot more detail about how the program was implemented in these schools, and that goes into some of the detail about the facilitator training practices that Greg and his team use. And then we also have a written design report describing the impact study. So if you're interested in these, there's a couple ways you can find it. One, under the handout section on the right-hand side of your screen, Kathy had posted a link, a PDF file that gives you the link to the full set of reports. Or if you're a do-it-yourself type person, you can just go online and in a search engine, search for the words ACF and streams, and that the first result should bring you up to the website for the evaluation where all these documents are posted. And to also say, we will be adding new reports over time. The evaluation isn't over. We're still analyzing data and collecting data for some of the sites. And so we will be continuing to analyze the data and write up results and posting new stuff over time. So with that, Kathy, I think you can go on to the next slide. And I will hand it back over to Rachel to facilitate the questions.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Ms. Flip. That was awesome and super informative. Right now, we've just got one question, but if others don't roll in, I've got a few to throw your way. So the first question comes from Stephanie, and she asked, and I think this was under the Make It Relevant slide, is about when this question came in. So she asked, what about students and adults who don't agree with the concept of marriage or who have historically been banned from the ability to get married, specifically LGBTQ students?
So this is Brian. I can start, and then I might pass it over to Flip. I think, you know, that each curriculum is different. I think in Relationship Smarts Plus, the first time I looked at the curriculum, I was surprised that I think the majority of the sections are really more about relationship skills more broadly, communication skills and conflict management skills that apply to all different types of relationships without reference to sort of marriage per se. But I'm guessing that question does come up from the schools and in the classroom. So Flip, I'd be curious to know how you all sort of handle those discussions when they come up with the students.
Well, actually, within the classrooms, is that, as you said, when we're talking about basic relationship skills, is that those skills are transferable into any relationship. So we talk to students about how do you have right relationships with your parents, with your school teachers, with your coaches, with one another. So when we learn basic skill sets, then they're transferable to every situation across the board.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you both hit on some really great points about the program being more of a focus and an emphasis on building these essential kind of relationship skills more broadly, and includes examples of this, not in the context of just romantic relationships and particularly not just marriages, but, you know, sibling relationships. There are, like Flip said, coaches and parents and things like that. So it's more broad in that aspect. All right, we've got another question. Oh, they're all just coming in now. Okay, so the first one that came in after Stephanie's is from Asuna. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the question is, does the curriculum include anything around forced marriages and or tools and resources for facilitators if they encounter students who may be facing potential forced marriage situations? Well, I can answer that question unless Brian or Flip would like to take that question.
You got it.
I got it. Okay. There isn't anything specifically about that, but we do offer a lot of tools and resources, not just for the facilitators, but we have handouts and references to a lot of different websites, and we encourage educators and facilitators to find kind of local resources that they think would be really beneficial for their young people that they're serving. So really emphasizing, considering the culture and the context and the population that you're working with, and doing what you can to address the needs of those individuals. So while it's not explicitly addressed in the program, like I said, we do our best to provide resources and encourage our the individuals facilitating and educating young people with this program to consider their young people that they're serving and what they might need, and how to go about kind of gathering those resources for those young people. So I hope that answers that question. And then we've got Karen saying, I think this is for Miss Flip because it says more than Conquerors. Your multi-level training system is impressive and comprehensive. Have you written this up anywhere?
We're in the process of doing so. And we have it internally written. We haven't published it anywhere, but we're going to do that as our strategic hiring and training plan because it's working. It takes time, but it does work. But if you wanted more information about it, we can provide that kind of support on a one-to-one basis.
Awesome. And then we've got another question from Annette saying, what were the steps to developing the education program from surveying students to developing curriculum to testing the program's effectiveness to classroom or group setting and evaluation? So I think this might be more for you, Brian.
So in this particular case, I think this case was a little bit unique. So MTCI had applied for and received federal grant funding from OFA to deliver the programming. And sort of separate but parallel to that, Mathematica and Public Strategies had been working with OFA on this broader evaluation. And so we had some general priorities for the evaluation, and then looked through this sort of bigger pool of organizations that received federal grant funding to find organizations that might be good candidates for the evaluation. And so during that process, we learned about MTCI, and so had some initial discussions with them and started learning more about their program and sort of developing a sort of partnership with them about the evaluation and how it would unfold. And I think the timing worked out well because at the same time we were looking for evaluation sites. I think Flip and her team were sort of looking to sort of take the next stage in evaluation. They've obviously been honing their model and their process for a while, and sort of felt ready to sort of take the next step of being involved in a formal federal evaluation like this. And so it is a big step for an organization. So we spent a lot of time, we went down to Atlanta, we spent, the day with them. They rolled out the red carpet for us and just sort of building a relationship. And, I think they had to make some adjustments to their sort of exactly how their process worked to support the evaluation. So we had like a collaborative process about talking about, the surveys. Here's the questions we want to ask for the evaluation. They were very good and helpful at telling us, what questions they felt, were going to be well received by the schools, what questions might raise issue with the school, and then just also talking about the process that was, getting parental permission and administering the surveys and all that sort of process. So it was, it was sort of like a partnership in the making where, we were looking to do the evaluation. I think they were open to the evaluation possibility. And so it was sort of the right place at the right time. And then it was, sort of a lot of hard work and trust and collaboration to getting to where we are today. Flip, you have anything you want to add to that?
I think you wrapped it up pretty well, Brian. That's exactly what happened.
All right, awesome. Let me see. Sorry, the questions are kind of coming in a weird order. So, Stephanie, I see your question about the program, and I guess this is something that I can answer more broadly. So unless someone else would like to jump in. But the question is this an abstinence-only curriculum? And if so, what do you do when the students want or need information on birth control methods and safe sex? So we have the program that they use is our 3.0 version. With our 4.0 version of the program, we offer an SRA, so sexual risk avoidance version of the program. But the classic version is obviously not an SRA version. So we do have information on birth control methods and safe sex practices in the newer version. So I hope that that answers your question. But if you have anything more specifically, I'd be happy to follow up with you if that's something that you're interested in learning more about separately. Okay, Annette asked, what was the time from start to completion? I think this might be for you, Brian, again.
Yes, so the I didn't go into all the details about the evaluation, but we enrolled students over the course of 2 school years. So let me make sure I get the dates right. I think this was the evaluation was sort of active during both the 2016-2017 school year and the 2017-2018 school year, both fall and spring semester. So that's 2 full school years. And then I didn't talk much about it during the presentation, but we are conducting a 12-month follow-up survey with the students. And so that meant that from the start of the baseline surveys through 2 years of programming, through all the follow-up surveys that actually extended over the course of 3 school years. And I'm happy to report we just finished up the follow-up surveys this past month. And so now we're going to be getting on to the data analysis. So it's a long process. I know not all evaluations necessarily need to or should take that long, but for this one, given our research questions and our goals, this sort of 3-year time frame was the sort of best fit for us.
Okay, let's see. All right, Natalie asked, were the sites that implemented the program in inner city type schools? So Flip, I think.
Actually, they are both suburban schools in Gwinnett County, which is our largest school district in Georgia, with primarily Latino and African American population. And so there is a mixture of students there. When we look at the one school, Meadow Creek, that could be considered kind of urban. But when you look at it in terms of the overall area of Gwinnett County, it would be looked at as suburban.
Okay. These are all awesome questions. Does anybody have any other questions for Miss Flip or Brian? Oh, let's see. Stephanie said that she would like a tip for teaching one facilitator's balanced fidelity and responsiveness to students.
Okay, Greg, you want to take that on?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, of course. The question is a tip for teaching facilitators balanced fidelity and responsiveness to students.
It might be because I'm from Georgia, but I'm losing a little bit in the translation.
No, that's okay. So I think the question is basically, how do you kind of educate your facilitators on being responsive to the students' kind of questions and interests while also balancing fidelity to the program?
Okay. It was a dialect. I'm very country, so that's why I couldn't understand it. One of the things that we do is, as a part of our training for our educators, is we provide facilitation training where we teach the facilitators how to field questions, and it's not a simple response, but you have to first evaluate what kind of question is being asked, and then based on the kind of question that's being asked, that would really determine what kind of response you get. But then the overall general unresponsiveness of students can be addressed, I think, through effective engagement strategies. And one of the ways we practice that is that when we do our teach backs, we have with a peer-to-peer teachbacks. We have peers or other facilitators acting as students before we let new facilitators actually have access to a real high school student. So when you have adults acting as students, they can be worse than any student you might ever teach, because they pull out all of the crazy scenarios that they've ever seen or experienced. So it gives those new facilitators a chance to really hone their skills and develop some ways that work with their personality with dealing with students' engagement.
Yes, I agree that sometimes the adults, they've had a variety of experiences, so they'll throw their most extreme experiences at the educators for practice. All right, let's see. So Annette asked, what motivated you to take on this project of evaluations to identify relationship needs among school-aged youth?
Well, as Brian was saying earlier, is that we had been doing on internal evaluation for a while. We have an independent evaluator that's been working with us for a long time. And in our minds, we felt we were doing an excellent job. And the feedback that we were getting from students suggested that, yes, you are doing an excellent job. But we wanted to know from a research standpoint if it was really in our heads or if it were really true. And of course, we're still waiting for those results. And so as time has gone on and we knew that the opportunity was there, is that we wanted to avail ourselves of that opportunity to take our organization to another level of expertise and another level of implementation that could only come with having some research or research background, whatever those findings will be. And so we wanted to put ourselves on the line to say, yes, let's do that. Let's see what we're really about as we go forth with Fidelity, as we understand facilitation skills, as we understand the curriculum and the scope and sequence and the purpose of it, and we get that and can deliver that with excellence, then let's see what the outcome can really be through research of the students that we serve. And so we want that real-time feedback for our organization so that we can learn from it, that we can grow from that. We'll look at where we need to make improvements, how we need to make improvements, what the research will tell us in terms of where we stand as a youth development organization. And we wanted to really know that,
Well, thank you, Ms. Flip. I have had the pleasure of training with you, and you and your group are absolutely wonderful. So I have no doubt that y'all will continue to be successful. But we're about out of time. And before we wrap things up, I want to make sure to tell you about what's to come next month. So we can go ahead and pass this along. So there is a brief survey at the end of this webinar. I've noted that to some of you who have expressed interest in the curriculum. So please take a moment to offer us feedback by completing that survey and indicating if you are interested in learning more about our program. So like we said, the webinar will be available in 3 days through this link. You can also email Kathy or myself if you want to gain some more information, or stay in touch by checking out our website, subscribing to our newsletter, checking us out on Facebook or LinkedIn, or giving us a call to learn more information. And then you can also always come back next month. So our next webinar will be May 8th, and it is by one of my dear friends and previous colleagues, Dr. Kathleen Halavity. She'll be talking about friends and crushes and discussing the effects of friends and friendships on romantic relationships. So before we close out, I just wanted to say thank you again one more time to Ms. Flip and for Brian for putting on a wonderful webinar and being just your awesome selves and answering all the questions that were sent your way. So thank you both so much, and hope to see everybody else next month.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.